Hey, welcome to Tape to Tape, powered by the Ram 1500 Sport. Rory, happy anniversary. 4 years. I don't know what episode this is, but it's 4 years now. We've been doing the Tape to Tape pod. Wow. It was November 2015. And the reason I bring it up is not only because no one's life has been the same since then with this special development. I always remember, and we've talked about this before, we talked about in the very first pod, should the Penguins burn it down?
Yeah.
And they went out and won the Stanley Cup 6 months later.
Yep.
And won another one. And we got to talk about them to start this one, because we're going to talk about team MVPs at the quarter. I wrote about that in the power rankings. You wrote about the league MVP in the newsletter.
Yep.
And Pittsburgh's MVP, Sidney Crosby, is out 6 weeks.
Minimum, too.
Minimum.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how long this goes. It's probably better that he gets the surgery done now, though, right? And comes back.
I would think so.
In 2 months or whatever it is.
When presumably they're still in or around a playoff spot. I mean, they had to go without Malkin for most of the first quarter. Now they got to go without Crosby for the next challenge.
Yeah, and there was a report that this actually kind of came up in preseason, and he elected not to have the surgery. He's been playing with it for a bit. So you can't go through the whole season like this and expect to play at a high level. And they need him now, maybe more than ever, right? With you're thinner than you've been through most of these years. Malkin, I mean, he's still great. I don't know if he's been the same or not. But this is the other thing, too. With Crosby out, Malkin usually goes into beast mode, right? So if you've got him on fantasy or whatever, maybe he's going to explode for you. I'm really interested to see what he does, if he follows that same pattern or not, because they now need him more than ever than they needed him before. But it sucks, right, when you lose one of the best players in the league for this long, and that's kind of been the story of his career. Like, he's hitting these milestones. He was supposed to get to 1,000 games this year. I want to check. Maybe that's in question now, whether or not he's going to get there. But at the end of his career, it's going to be how much better would his numbers have been, how much better would his performances have been if he was able to stay healthy.
Sure, absolutely.
Which is actually similar to another famous Penguin, right? Mario Lemieux.
Yep.
Same kind of debate.
Absolutely. We are going to bring on the show as well. We should mention Andrew Berkshire is going to join us. He is a Sportsnet contributor, works for Sport Logic, and he's a data man. So he's going to crunch some hard numbers for us and give us some hard truth on a few trends and early storylines in the NHL. He's going to run it through the analytics lens and see what it spits out. But before we get there, let's talk about what we've seen from some well-performing players through the first quarter of the season. If people want the Sportsnet newsletter, and they should, they can sign up at sportsnet.ca. Went out Thursday morning, and you had top three MVP
a couple of honorable
mentions
mentions in there as well. Yeah, for me, two of them were easy calls. Leon Draisaitl and Nathan MacKinnon, for sure, top three finalists for the Hart. It was interesting, though, because I picked those two guys, and then I just kind of canvassed the newsroom. Like, who are your Hart Trophy candidates, top three at the quarter mark, looking for the opinion on that third one. And it took a while before Draisaitl's name even came up, because the thinking is, well, it's got to be Connor McDavid, right?
Yeah.
But Draisaitl's got 26 even strength points in 20 games. He's the first player to have at least 25 even strength points through the first 20 games of his season since Jaromir Jagr did it in 99-2000. So it's not like he's leaning on power play. In the little bits that he's been away from Connor McDavid at 5-on-5, Draisaitl's shot share has gone up. McDavid's shot share has gone down a little bit. So I don't even think you can make the case that this guy is like riding shotgun, riding Connor McDavid's coattails. And it all kind of comes full circle when you look back, 2017, they signed Connor McDavid for $12.5 million. Then a month or two later, they signed Draisaitl for $8.5. And the general takeaway from that was that's an overpay for this guy. He can't carry his own line. He's had one strong season, 70-plus points, followed 51, I think it was. Can he sustain that? Can he carry his own line? I think he can carry his own line. They're not asking him to do that right now, but he's found such a great fit with Connor McDavid, who he's not being carried by, and he's a great player in his own right. He's the leading scorer, leading primary assists, leading goal scorer at 5-on-5 in the entire league. The guy's a beast. Him and McDavid together are just grabbing the entire Oilers team by the back of their neck and taking them to the top of the division right now. He's got to be my number one candidate. McKinnon's got to be number 2, and there's an interesting debate between the two because McKinnon actually has lost 2 line mates who are great in their own right, and he's still got 11 points in 7 games without them and carrying them. It was the real tough one for me was who is number 3? Who is your number 3?
Well, I didn't look at it through a league-wide lens. I was going team by team, but obviously David Pastrnak has to be very high in the conversation. I mean, you did a good job of untangling Draisaitl from McDavid there, but I do feel like it's a tough exercise when you're talking about, guys who were so closely linked and obviously on the perfection line. It's the old debate. If you're taking the true meaning of the word valuable, well, don't all these 3 entities, or in the case of McDavid and Draisaitl, these 2 kind of take away from each other's value a little bit,
Oh, I mean, the same should have been true for Nikita Kucherov last year,
too.
But then maybe he just won the scoring title by so much, that's hard to ignore. And maybe that's what a guy like Draisaitl has to accomplish to actually be the MVP. And I think if this won't be these 3 players, but this is the discussion we're having at the end of the season. Ultimately, you are going to have split votes between McDavid and Draisaitl and Marchand and Pastrnak, and then that kind of clears the way for a guy like McKinnon to maybe run away with that award a bit. But I just look, the guy is the better point producer of the 2 right now, and I just cited all those numbers. Like it's just hard for me to not give it to Draisaitl right now.
Yeah, and Pastrnak is leading the league in goals right now.
Exactly. So. But then at the end of it, I didn't even end up putting Pastrnak on the list as number 3. He was an honorable mention. It was at the end of it, I can't ignore John Carlson's amazing start. 30 points in 20 games. If he scores 39 points in his remaining, 62 games.
There you go.
That's a considerable fall from what his career average has been over the last 3 years. That would still make him a top 20 point producer from the blue line in the salary cap era. So things would have to crumble pretty badly for him to not be a Norris Trophy finalist at the end of the year, I think, at this point. He's 11 points clear of the next highest scoring defenseman, so looking at it through that lens too, it was hard to not mention him in the top 3. So he was the 3rd. Pastrnak definitely was an honorable mention, as was Elias Pettersson.
All right, so you mentioned Draisaitl. I had him as the Oilers MVP. I went team by team in the power rankings, and Elias Pettersson, sort of a no-brainer for Vancouver, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the guy's just been... He had that little bit of a slow start, and there were the questions because he did tail off at the end of last year too, like what's going to happen here? And then it doesn't take long before, we talked about on the top 50 ranking, who was the guy that could absolutely shoot up these rankings. And we both agreed that Pettersson is the guy who, wherever we had him ranked, somewhere in the 20s or 30s even maybe, he could be a top 5 player next year for sure.
So we're going to talk with Andrew a bit about the Jets and the Habs and the Leafs. But we'll go through each Canadian team's MVP at the quarter as I had it. So Pettersson, Vancouver, Draisaitl, Edmonton will just stay in the West. I had Matthew Tkachuk for Calgary, 9 even strength goals. Only Draisaitl has more. There's a few guys actually at 9. Just kind of feels like he's been talked about as the heartbeat of that team since he got there. Or at least, I mean, Mark Giordano's obviously the captain and is the real leader there, but I mean, I feel like anytime you're reading or talking to Eric Francis, our correspondent out there, it just quickly comes up that Matthew Tkachuk really is kind of the guy who stokes the fire, certainly up front.
Yeah, well, and certainly the top
puts
line,
the points up. But
the top line hasn't been producing as expected. So, I said at the start of the season, if you believed in these Calgary Flames this season, you had to believe that Matthew Tkachuk was going to have a big year because he provided that punch from the second line. So now that we're not getting the usual from the top line, now it's even more important. More weight is landing on his shoulders to produce. I think you can even make a really strong case that David Riddick is their MVP to this point. A huge, heavy workload to the point where he was on pace for 66 starts earlier this week. They surprisingly gave the start to Cam Talbot on Wednesday night. They're going to have to find a way to rest this guy, but at the same time, he's been so key and so strong for them, and you're kind of fighting in that, 8th, 9th place in the Western Conference right now. You don't have the leeway that a team like Vancouver might, where you're out ahead enough that, okay, you can rest your starter a little bit. You need David Riddick to give you some solid starts because you don't know really what Cam Talbot is to this point. So he's been, from where he was last year, not knowing what he's going to be, to now looking like a legitimate heavy workload starter. That's a huge development too for the Calgary Flames. So for me, it's really between those two guys.
We won't get into the debate about whether goalie should qualify for the
Sure.
MVP today. We'll save that for another one, especially because my Winnipeg pick was Conor Helleberg.
Has to be, doesn't it?
It has to be. No one who's played as many games as Conor Helleberg has as good an even strength save percentage. He was a huge, I don't want to say huge question mark. He was going to be, there were going to be a lot of eyes on him coming into this year. 2 years ago, he was second runner-up in the Vezina. Last year, didn't fall off a cliff or anything, but wasn't at the same level. Coming in with so much turnover on that defense and Byfuglien being out, you knew they were going to need him to be big. And especially the past half dozen games or so, he really has been.
Yeah, and really at the core of it is that Winnipeg, because of all their losses on defense, they are way easier to get to the net front on than ever before. The big bodies are gone. They've been replaced by smaller guys, less physical guys. And so they give up more high danger chances than any team in the league. And, I was, unless something changes here, I was really wrong on Hellebuck because his underlying numbers on those high danger chances in the years leading up to now were not good. They were comparable to Jake Allen's. And so the thinking went, if he faces more of those chances, he's going to let in more goals and he's going to look worse. He's going to be exposed. And that hasn't been the case. He's absolutely risen to this challenge. You're absolutely right. He's been the team MVP to this point. If he did what it was projected that he was going to do with this kind of with these kind of shots coming at him, Winnipeg might be at the bottom of the Western Conference right now. Blake Wheeler has been struggling a little bit. They've split those two guys up. Brian Little's been out. They've been dealing with injuries galore on top of everything else. And so just to have that rock in Conor Hellebuck that maybe we didn't see happening has been hugely important for them hanging in that race.
Did you know Austin Matthews has 0 goals but 7 assists in his past 3 games?
There you go. That's incredible.
You probably didn't know because no one's talking about that because the Leafs are lost 3 in a row as we record this and no one cares. But he's actually an even 13 and 13 for 26. But all the conversation in Toronto is about what they need from other people or who's been out of the lineup, with Tavares then coming back, then Marner's out.
Yeah.
But Austin Matthews, I think, maybe you can make a case for Morgan Rielly plays so much back there and does produce, but Freddie Anderson had the not great start. I think it's got to be Austin Matthews in his 13 goals.
I don't even think Morgan Rielly's start has been that great. I think it's been a little disappointing. He does have a heavy workload, and you can maybe make the case that he plays with Cody Ceci, and if you don't like Cody Ceci, maybe you think he's a drag on Rielly or whatever, but the fact of the matter is Rielly hasn't been up to his own standard to this point. With the injuries to Marner and Tavares, like you said, Hyman's out of the lineup, and that's had a kind of ripple effect. Matthews is the only one left standing there as well. He's been meeting expectations, so he's the team MVP to this point. And, he legitimately could get to 50 goals this year. And just that fact alone is going to launch you into any kind of MVP debate if you're there at the end of the season.
Do you know who's on pace for exactly 50 goals this year?
Alex Ovechkin?
Jean-Gabriel Pageau.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
The MVP at the corner.
He was my next guess, yes.
Career best, 19. And, this is very intriguing because he is a pending UFA on a rebuilding team, but a team that also went out and got Vlad Nemesnikov because it wanted to insulate these kids.
Been great.
He's been great. Yeah. Point is, this isn't necessarily the no-brainer sell, I think, that it might be in other circumstances. He's an Ottawa guy. Is this a guy who Ottawa is going to want to keep around for the long haul? The flip side is anyone trading for Jean-Gabriel Pageau knows he's not a 50-goal scorer. What he is has been a very reliable two-way center with a little flicker of offense. Yeah. So even though you're not getting the 50-goal guy, he's someone you would have been interested in anyways as a depth center guy, a third line, help you out on that third line. If you're a playoff team looking for that kind of player who can be very important in the playoffs, it'll be interesting to see how this one goes.
Like, I don't think you're getting a first-round pick back or anything for Jean-Gabriel Pageau.
I don't think
right?
so.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, you kind of have to judge this based on what is the return. What are the auto centers being offered here? If it goes above market value, then you have to consider it. But Wayne Scanlon did a great piece on this kind of conundrum, I guess, for us last week. And, you know, at some point, those two ideas meet, they intersect. Do you give up the guy just to recoup assets because you're rebuilding, or do you keep him because he is a veteran presence? You need somebody who is an NHL player to play minutes and maybe set a tone in the dressing room, set that bar, set that expectation. And I don't think you can just thoughtlessly give those guys up for whatever assets you can get. I think there is that value that you need to have enough of those guys in the room so that you're not following the Edmonton Oilers model and it is just harder to have everything come together. It takes longer than you expect. Maybe you spoil some of these young guys. You rush them too soon because you don't have the NHL ready players to fill those roles. I am kind of on the side right now throwing the idea that he's a 50-goal scorer out the window, because obviously he's not, that it might just be better for them to keep this player because it could come together a little quicker than you think. I think, you know, you might have to start thinking about sending Erik Brandstrom back down to the AHL. Some of their young guys in the AHL have been performing pretty well. You don't want to bring them up now, but maybe next year is when you do. Thomas Chabot has been playing huge minutes and being fantastic for them. You got to figure out your future in net, but you've got a couple of prospects in the system too, and maybe one of them hit. But I think we've seen that if you surround the youngsters with veterans and you bring them up when they're actually ready, your rebuild can get on track much quicker than it looks the year before it actually hits, right? So the Senators are in that spot where it might actually be better to just keep this guy rather than get, I don't know, a second-round pick and a secondary prospect.
Yeah. No one's having a fantastic year in Montreal. The team has a pretty good record. We're going to talk a little more, as I mentioned, with Andrew Berkshire about the Habs. Carey Price has started to look very good recently. He's clearly still the epicenter of the team. But I think the MVP has to be Jonathan Drouin, who is in a
amazing, isn't it?
Real show-me season. It wasn't going well there in the exhibition. Maybe that was Montreal just getting a little crazy off the hop.
Yeah.
But he has done a nice job. 7 goals, 8 assists, and been really, I would say, the team's best forward since the start of the year.
He was in trade rumors at the start of the year out of camp because he was so bad. And now you're talking about him as a team MVP. Did you consider Jeff Petrie much?
Yes.
Yeah.
He would have been the other one.
I was wondering, that would have been a tough call for me. But I think it's a nice kind of tip of the cap to Drouin for how he's kind of responded to this, because he's been absolutely fantastic. If there ever was... If you ever wanted to trade him, if there was ever any serious consideration going into that, does the fact that he's playing this well now make you want to trade him more or want to trade him less because now you need him? You need him actually doing the things that he's doing.
Yeah, I think they need him. I mean, it's still a team that doesn't have much in the way of high-end forward skill. And he's still, even among the prospects that they hope hit, I mean, with the possible exception of Cole Caulfield, I think Drouin still has the most God-given offensive ability, and the best case scenario for them is that at 24 years old here, it's finally starting to surface. So, I mean, there's a sell high argument. If Claude Julien, having watched him for 2 years, is just like, I feel like this guy's going to always have peaks and valleys. Now would be the time, but I don't see it happening.
Your strength, amazingly, somehow, is down the middle now up front.
Yes.
I mean, who saw that coming a year or two ago?
That's a good tease for something I want to get into a little bit in the second segment about dealing from a position of strength. But it's true, it absolutely is, and I think a great Twitter poll to put out there among the Habs followers is, you mentioned Jeff Petrie. I wonder what Marc Bergevin's best move as GM has been. Is it getting Petrie for, I'm going to say, a second round pick from Edmonton, and it might have even been a third. Let's say second. At the trade deadline in 2015, and then signing him to an extension? Or is it getting Philip Deneau from the Chicago Blackhawks along with a draft pick for Dale Weiss when they were selling at the at the deadline a couple years ago when things were going off the rails, because those two players have become absolutely integral for Montreal. And though I'm giving it to Drouin, I mean, Petrie for sure would have been the runner-up, and Phillip Danault really is growing into a Patrice Bergeron light for this team. Does everything, wins face-off, all scenarios, and yeah, I mean, he is starting to show some, some offensive chops, playing on the line between Brendan Gallagher and Thomas Tatar. So yeah.
It's interesting that you use Bergeron's name there, because in the last game Montreal played against Boston, Danault's line dominated the perfection line. I think their possession was, their Corsi was over 60% at 5-on-5 against the quote-unquote perfection line. So, I mean, if that's something that is going to develop here when those two teams meet, that could, can you imagine that playoff series if that's actually a thing?
Yeah.
The nose line can hang with the perfection line. That changes the whole outlook, the whole dynamic of what that could be. I mean, you could doss in the Max Domi pickup too for Alex Galchenyuk. I mean, Galchenyuk's now in Pittsburgh, so he's already moved on from the team they traded him to Domi for. And what's he doing there?
Even the Subban for Weber trade is probably
not as bad as it
aging
looked like.
better than, it's funny because the immediate take was, well, this might be a wash right now, but it's going to age poorly for Montreal.
I still think it was never about It was never about what that trade was going to be that season or the next season, maybe even this season. It was about what is 39, 40-year-old Shea Weber going to be making $7+ million, right? That's where the trouble is, where Subban comes off the books in 2 years after this one. That's the only thing, but hey, you know what? You're going to have Shea Weber on your blue line too, and if he ages gracefully, you'll take that.
He can still crank it. Phillip Danault acquired from Chicago with Chicago's second-round pick, so they got Danault and a second-rounder for Fleischmann and Weiss. Jeff Petrie acquired from the Edmonton Oilers. Let me just dig it up. For Montreal's second. So there you go. It was a second. So not bad. Boy, and a fourth later on.
Edmonton could really use him right now.
Yeah, it's true. All right. We are going to move along here on Tape to Tape. We've got Andrew Berkshire coming up a few segments from now. Coming up on the other side of the break, though, a little fantasy talk right here on Tape to Tape. Hey, welcome back to Tape to Tape. If you are watching or listening to this pod, there's a good chance you're into fantasy hockey. Don't forget to check out the Sportsnet Fantasy Pool presented by RAM at sportsnet.ca/RAM. You can win all kinds of awesome prizes, including a 2020 RAM 1500 Sport. Rory, it's been a pretty quiet couple weeks in my fantasy hockey world. I'm coming hard back to earth in the Yahoo pool we're in together, the non-keeper one. Yep. I'm actually doing okay in the other one. Yeah, moving up the ranks. I thought I'd be selling off all these pieces, and turns out I'm the Vegas Golden Knights of the Backyard Oasis pool. But still lots of trade talk. I have to say it is addictive, just like the fake trade talk. And one thing that's been on my mind about trades a little bit these days. So I was listening to The Fan, and Wendell Clark was on, and Scott MacArthur brought up the big 92-93. The Leafs went both years to the conference final, but the first year where Cliff Fletcher, no surprise given he didn't shy away from big moves, but Cliff Fletcher traded Grant Fuhr to the Buffalo Sabres when Felix Potvin basically had about 30 games of experience in the NHL. So, I mean, Fuhr had just been acquired a couple years prior by Fletcher to solidify the goaltending. But basically, they looked at Potvin and said, we think this kid can do it. Only one of them can play.
Yep.
Let's trade Fuhr. They got Dave Andrechuk and, to be fair, another goalie back, Darren Pupa. But it got me thinking about, like, should teams be looking to do that more, dealing from an area of strength, even if it's a risk or, even if in some cases you might be giving up the better player, but that player isn't worth as much to your team because you already have a bunch of that. You need something else. I mean, I do think you have to think about it in the context of the Leafs. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk a little about whether the Leafs should be looking hard at trading William Nylander with Andrew Berkshire.
Yeah.
But, that's been a conversation in Toronto.
Yep.
They have lots of great forwards. Until this past summer, it would seem they had need on defense and probably are again. And then we were talking about the Canadiens in the last segment. They've got Ryan Poehling, Nick Suzuki, Phil Deneau, and Max Domi, and Jesperi Kotkaniemi either playing center now for the team or looking like guys who will play center, in the NHL for a long, long time to come. So as much as it's nerve-wracking to move someone like that, if you're a team like the Canadiens that needs help on the left side of the D, should you be out there beating the bushes to say, even though it's somewhat counterintuitive to trade a young center, we got to find D?
You got to be really careful.
Well, because don't trade the wrong one.
Then you end up in a situation where you're trading Taylor Hall for Adam Larson. I would rather have a weakness on defense and be absolutely stacked up front.
Okay.
I think you can. Look at the Pittsburgh Penguins. They've won cups with that formula, right? Granted, they did have Chris Letang, so they had at least one superstar defenseman back there to hang their hat on. But they've been top heavy, they've been forward heavy, and they've won that way. I think you even say the same is true about Washington, right? Like they found Michael Kempny, and he was their great big find at the trade deadline, and he's fine and everything like that. But he's not one of these guys you would go and trade a top six forward for, I wouldn't think. And they were pretty top heavy and pretty loaded up front. So I just think you can get by more that way, and the example of the Leafs trade there, like that's something that, like a team that maybe is close to that situation, like comparable right now would be Vancouver. Thatcher Demko's been phenomenal when he's been in net for Jacob Markstrom. Jacob Markstrom's on an expiring contract. You look like you're ahead of schedule here. Do you throw caution to the wind, trade Jacob Markstrom for help wherever you're going to need it at that time, and hope that pushes you forward? Vancouver's probably not at the stage that Toronto was in 92, 93, but they are further ahead, and we're talking about a UFA here. I just think, especially today where you have split workloads in net, and Demko being so young, I don't know if it's the right time to really commit to that guy or not. What I would say, though, is that I wish teams would do, look at what's happened to the Winnipeg Jets, where Bufflin's come out. You've been hit with injuries, and now there's legitimately questions of, is the window closed? Is it closing? They're certainly not as solid contenders for the Cup as they have been in years past. San Jose Sharks, same thing, where they look much, much weaker than they have in the past. I would say if you feel like your Cup window is open, go as hard as you possibly can for it. That's when you get a little bit more risky, I think, with your
you're
trades.
saying those teams should have loaded up more in the past?
Yeah, like Winnipeg did to a degree, where 2 years in a row they traded a first-round pick for a second-line center. But for years, the kind of running joke at the trade deadline was, where's Kevin Cheveldayoff? Why isn't he doing anything? It took him years to do an NHL player for NHL player trade, where maybe that window could have been opened a little earlier, or at least been kicked down maybe, if you were a little bit more aggressive on the trade front, and maybe you would have broken through a little bit earlier. Maybe you would have had more than the one run that they did, the one run to the Western Conference Final. Because if, this is a team that could potentially bounce back to a degree, but we could be looking back 5 years from now at the team that Winnipeg was and say, they only got one run out of all these guys that they had. If they don't figure it out here, why weren't they more aggressive at it? Same could be said about the San Jose Sharks too, maybe. Like, why they did get aggressive in getting Erik Carlsson. Could they have done a little bit more? Could they have traded first-round picks, more prospects or whatever? There are teams that you can easily say their Stanley Cup window is open, and they can kind of just look at their rosters and say, okay, we need a third pair defenseman. We need a penalty kill specialist or something like that. And that's what they'll chase at the trade deadline and not give up too much. Maybe those are the teams that should be a little more aggressive and trade away a top prospect for something. And the best example of that is probably the Vegas Golden Knights, right? Like, they trade Erik Brandstrom.
Yeah.
That's a team that we all thought when they came in, be careful, build up your prospect base and kind of have a long-term view. And instead they traded away top half of the first round draft picks, maybe a superstar defenseman in the making, certainly a good-looking defenseman in the making, for Max Pacioretty, who they had then had to sign for the long term. And
Mark Stone.
Mark Stone, who they then
Suzuki
had
was
Suzuki from Pacioretty.
Yeah.
Same thing, right?
Yeah.
Like they do the same things here, and they are going for it hard. If it pays off for Vegas, then maybe that's the kind of blueprint that other teams can follow here.
Jump through the window, friends.
There
That is the lesson from Rory. All right, we're going to learn some lessons from Andrew Berkshire of Sport Logic when we come back right here on Tape to Tape. This segment brought to you by Subway. Subway now delivers. No joke. Time now for our Subway Overtime segment. No joke. Subway now delivers. Joining us on the line today, Andrew Berkshire. He is a contributor to Sportsnet.ca and works for Sport Logic. Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
We are doing fantastic, and we're going to be much more knowledgeable when you're done telling us what some hard data can tell us about some early season trends and performances in the NHL. So the first one we'd like to ask you about is, and this might be timely because the Leafs are on a 3-game losing streak as we record this. Should they seriously look into trading William Nylander?
Well, usually when I look at a team that's really struggling to put things together and you have a lot of guys who are kind of underperforming or not fitting in the right spots, I like to trade away the guy who's really carrying the load. I don't understand the obsession with trading William Nylander. He's the one guy that they signed of the big three that signed for around what was expected market value. Everyone else got the big money. He's having a great season, really rebounding from last year. I think last time I checked, he was actually only outdone by Matthews in terms of his even strength impact on the Leafs this year. I really don't get it. Like, what is it about this guy that has so many people that hate him? Like, I feel like I understand that sometimes he can look a little lackadaisical out there, but he's such a good player, and I think people really underestimate his ability to defend in the neutral zone and how much impact that has. And you look at Austin Matthews' numbers with and without him, and it's jarring how much those guys work, or how well those guys work together. So I don't understand this one. I really don't.
What's up with this city wanting to trade their best performing players sometimes, especially when you need them? You traded Kadri in his great value contract for some other reasons for sure, but now we're talking about, or debating Nylander, and he's got his own, not as great of a value, but a good contract, like Andrew said. What are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to get to what the Edmonton Oilers are, where you're super top heavy? I don't think that's anybody's goal. Is it?
Yeah, it does kind of seem a little bit similar to, it's later in the game, but it could draw some parallels to the Taylor Hall trade, right? Where it was a guy who had great performances, but for whatever reason, certain people didn't like, and you lost that trade heavily, right? You get to say it's probably the worst trade in terms of overall return value since like Philippe Forsberg. So that's a rough one, and I feel like Nylander probably, I would trust Kyle Dubas to do a better job than I would Peter Chiarelli, but it's one of those things where his intrinsic value to the Maple Leafs is probably a lot higher than his market value because of the way that he's talked about. So it's one of those situations where not only would it be a bad idea to trade him from a value perspective, what he's bringing to your team, but also what you're going to get back probably isn't nearly as good as William Nylander.
Yeah. Okay. That's some sanity. Bring some sanity into this city, not trading William Nylander. Let's go a little bit closer to home for you there, Andrew, and talk about the Montreal Canadiens. Are they one of Canada's best 3 teams in the NHL?
I think they probably are at this stage. I expect eventually that the top 3 right now is kind of like Oilers, Canucks, Canadiens, and the Leafs are kind of struggling down in 4th. I don't expect that to stay the whole season. I expect it to be shaken up quite a bit. But I think of the 3 teams that are in there right now, I think the Canadiens are probably the most likely to keep it going all season. They're a weird team, though, in that they're kind of all offense, no defense. They're really struggling to make things easier on Carey Price. And, he faced a lot of criticism early in the year for being substandard, kind of similar to last year. But then when I ran the numbers for it for a Sportsnet column, I think last week, he's actually saving over a half goal per game at 5-on-5 alone, which is crazy. So they're giving up crazy amounts of high-quality chances and generating the same, and so far it's working out. And I guess with Carey Price in the back, you can kind of afford to do that. But they're very much a boom or bust team. If things work out for them, especially early in the game, they're great. But if they struggle a little bit and, they have trouble getting the offense going, they can get blown out of the water pretty easy.
The anti-New York Islanders a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. And I feel like they're probably so entertaining to watch because they're the anti-New York Islanders, right? They're kind of the way you want the league to trend, but probably a little bit too far to be a sustainable, contender level team. Mm-hmm. But they should be in the hunt for a playoff spot all season long.
So one team that is basically always in the playoffs going back 2 decades is the San Jose Sharks. But what does the data tell you about whether or not the Sharks window is closing? Certainly got off to a rough start, have rebounded a bit. Digging into it, what do you see in San Jose?
I mean, it's kind of a weird period for San Jose, right? Because they have this group of good players who are clearly past their prime, and despite the fact that Joe Thornton seems to still be great, he's not Joe Thornton of 27 years old. He's not going to take the team on his back and carry them into the playoffs. And then you have a bunch of players in their early to mid-30s, and then they have their next group coming up of really great players like Kevin LeBlanc, Thomas Hertl, Timo Meier. But there's this huge gap between what's coming up and what's been there for a long time. And then losing Joe Pavelski also, I think, hurt a lot because the Sharks were a team last year that kind of relied on being a Gatling gun team from the perimeter and tipping shots in. And Meier's great at that, Hertl's great at that, and Pavelski's great at that. So you had this triumvirate of players that you could put throughout your lineup that could get into the front of the net and cash on those rebounds or deflections. And this year, removing Pavelski has really hurt them. And they don't seem to be willing to move away from that perimeter-style hockey. So maybe a coaching change could get them going again. But it seems to me like that ability to be a contender gets thinner and thinner every single year. And, we're seeing that. And they're still probably a better team than what they've looked like overall so far. Some things have gone bad for them, but they just don't strike me as a team that's very dangerous. Even last year, they had no business getting out of the first round. They had a great 5 minutes in the Game 7 there against Vegas on a penalty that should not have been called, and they took advantage of it, and all credit to them for that, but they should have been out.
It's another star player on that team that gets a lot of criticism, I think. Erik Carlsson, is he someone you're at all worried about? I know he's dealt with injuries and stuff, and that's maybe a factor here. But what is he having a strong season, or is there a little bit of worry of decline or anything going on there?
I mean, at his age, there's always going to be decline. But I think the thing with Carlsson is there's so much room to decline from what his performance level is that it just doesn't worry me. Even through the course of that contract, I don't see him really struggling to be worthwhile. I think the main thing that's changed for him is his shooting, right? Ever since he's gone to San Jose, his goal scoring has really dried up. Now, I don't know if that's because he has to defer to Brent Burns a lot on the power play. I don't know if it's because he's just really struggled to get into a good shooting position with the injuries to his lower body that he's had to suffer through. But overall, his impacts remain phenomenal. There's really nothing to suggest that Carlsson isn't a high impact player that's worth that contract at this stage. He's definitely holding up more than some of his peers. I'd be far more worried about, the similar aged guys who are paid a lot of money like Drew Doughty, PK Subban, all those guys than I would about Erik Carlsson.
All right, so let's move to the Winnipeg Jets. Super interesting team with everything they've been through. They can't be healthy. There's no luck really breaking their way. Recently split up Blake Wheeler and Mark Scheifele, which they really didn't want to do, and they're kind of forced into it. Wheeler's playing center, or has been for the last couple of games. Do you think the Jets are a stronger team with those guys split up, playing center down on two separate lines?
Well, I don't know if they're better off playing center on two different lines, but I do think that the Jets need to split those two up. They're a line that worked really, really well 3 years ago, and then since then have kind of outscored their poor performance. And there's something to be said for that. They're really extremely talented, but Blake Wheeler has been in the midst of a pretty steep decline over the last couple of years that people haven't really noticed because he's putting up mega amounts of points on the power play. And overall, him and Scheifele just haven't been great together. So I think it's worthwhile to explore that. And the other thing is the Jets' center depth is just awful, right? Like, all due respect to Brian Little, who I believe is hurt right now anyway, I don't think he's a second-line center anymore. I think that ship sailed a couple years ago, and even as a third-line center, he kind of struggled at times last season. So is it worthwhile to explore? They have no way to like, it can't get worse. They have no way to avoid it. They have to try something, and that D-core doesn't give them a lot of room to play around with.
Any other trends out there that the numbers are telling you about, or anything that digging into some data has revealed that might run a little counter to the common perception out there?
Well, I mean, there's always the interesting teams that start out really hot and then fade off real quick, and usually you can see that from the win-loss department, and then the data, the underlying data tells you the story of like, oh, well, this team was never real. But this year, strangely, the Philadelphia Flyers and Buffalo Sabres started out absolutely dominant to a ridiculous degree. And then both teams have fallen off extremely harshly in the underlying numbers. Philadelphia's kind of hanging on a little bit. They're 6-2-2 in the last 10. And I think that's just because they have a lot of talent there, a lot of mature talent. But I don't necessarily think they're going to be able to, rally and make the playoffs. Although, like I said, they have a lot of mature talent, and Carter Hart could be great down the stretch. Buffalo, I think, is once again a sinking ship, and I feel bad for them because it feels like they're finally making incremental progress, but they're just nowhere close to where they need to be.
Poor Buffalo.
Buffalo.
My heart goes out to the fans. Hang in there. Who knows? Maybe they'll turn a corner eventually. All right, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, guys.
All right, that is Andrew Berkshire of Sport Logic, a regular contributor to Sportsnet.ca, as is my co-host here, Rory Boylan. Check him out all the time on the site. You can also find him on Twitter at Rory Boylan, myself at Dixon on Sports. And come back next week for more glass rattling hockey action on Tape to Tape.